Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Vovchansk, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians and a single advance in favor of the Ukrainians. The Russians managed to advance within the southern parts of Vovchansk, south of the Vovchansk line, where they are attempting to establish a proper foothold south of the river line and build up their forces to gain full control over the town, which will improve the logistics of the Russian forces operating in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region. The Russians also continue their offensive operations within Kupyansk, where they are pushing through along the railway to gain control over the northern parts of the railway line, going through the central parts of the city. The Russians also managed to continue their offensive operations throughout the Serebryansky forest area, as they continue developing their offensive operations to cut off the last supplies going to Ukrainian forces within the forest area and to gain control over the eastern flank of Liman, northern flank of Seversk. The Ukrainians continue their offensive operations to regain control over the positions northeast of Pokrovsk, where they are attempting to cut off the supplies going to the Russian forces operating further north in the direction of Kucherev Yar. The Russians managed to gain control over additional significant portions of the first line of defense in the Zaporizhia region, where the Russians are keeping a steady pace, getting control over these fortified positions bit by bit. Starting out in the northern section of the front line in the direction of Vovchansk, the Russians continue their offensive operations to gain control over a foothold here across the Vovchansk river line. The Russians now have a significant presence to the south of the Vovchansk river line, mainly in the forest patch area, but they are also expanding within the town itself. Taking a closer look, we can see the Russians have managed to gain control over the northern outskirts. However, these buildings so far are not powerful enough for the Russians to hold a proper foothold that allows them to build up a large concentration of forces. Instead, the Russians need to gain control over the remaining parts of the industrial area and the fire station area here in the northeastern parts and enter into the residential area before they can start building up their forces further. They currently have control over two crossings across the Vovchansk river line into the town itself, here from the central parts, which again, the northern parts of Vovchansk is also largely destroyed, as is well documented, which means that the supply lines going to the Russian forces operating south of the Vovchansk river line is also very far away. This means that the Russian buildup of forces has to take place further away from Vovchansk. An example could be Hatysha, where the Russian forces then have to supply through the open fields, cross the river line and into the southern parts of Vovchansk, as the northern part of Vovchansk cannot be used to build up a large enough force to cross over. This is why the main push to the south of the Vovchansk river line is coming from the forest patch area, which is closer to these additional supply lines that comes from the western direction away from Vovchansk, where the Russians cannot have a large concentration of forces. The objective of the Russians is to gain a large enough foothold within the southern parts of Vovchansk to establish a supply hub in the southern parts, which will then allow them to have a much shorter distance for further offensive operations, mainly through the railway area. Gaining control over the railway station in the central parts of Vovchansk will split the town into two parts: the eastern part along the Vovchansk river line and the western part along the forest patch area. Russians will look to gain control over the settlement of Sinelnikove and then push to gain control over the western parts of the railway, establishing themselves in that direction, and then moving through along the river line to gain control over the eastern parts as well, gaining control over the entirety of Vovchansk as well as Sinelnikove, will allow the Russians to establish a proper bridgehead across the Vovchansk river line and launch offensive operations beyond that of Vovchansk, mainly along the river lines to gain control over the river line positions, pushing through the forest patch areas and into the positions along the Vovchansk river line to have additional crossings to expand the zone of control here in the northeast of Kharkiv. The Russians are likely planning a larger operation here in the northeastern parts of Kharkiv that will take place following the capture of Kupyansk and Vovchansk, where the Russians can launch offensive operations to connect the two locations by advancing from several directions, including the Vereshna, Kupyansk, Milove, and Vovchansk, to combine in the central parts. Getting control over the border area will allow the Russians to establish proper supply lines for their forces to advance offensive operations further south, potentially expanding to the Izium direction and generally the east of Kharkiv. Speaking of Kupyansk, the Russians continue offensive operations within the city, where they've managed to advance through the northern flank of the railway area. The Russians are here advancing through the residential area, following the bridgehead and foothold within the city itself. The Russians are also expanding offensive operations within the apartment complex area in the southern direction towards the industrial area. The Russians are completely bypassing the apartment complex area in the central parts of the northern parts of Kupyansk. This is to encircle the Ukrainian forces in the area. Bypassing it allows them to gain control of it without a battle. By gaining control over the apartment complex area in the eastern parts, the Russians will have control over the road connecting Kupyansk between the east and the west. At the same time, it will allow them to cut the flank of the apartment complex area in the central parts, and connecting with the forces from the west, he'll be able to physically encircle the Ukrainian forces, gain control over everything north of the railway line, will allow the Russians to push into the eastern parts of Kupyansk across the river line, and to gain control over the northern parts of the city, which will allow the Russians to concentrate a significant amount of forces within Kupyansk itself, and to develop offensive operations to gain control over the remaining parts and the southern parts of the city. Getting control over the entirety of Kupyansk will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions here along the Uskar River line on both the eastern and western banks, as will allow the Russians to encircle the Ukrainian forces operating east of the Uskar River line along these fortified positions, as well as to develop offensive operations to gain full control over these positions, allowing them to concentrate their forces in different directions, whether it is across the river line in the Kupyansk in the western direction or down south towards Borova. The Russians can have safe concentrations of forces and have the Svatove direction, the logistical hub there, focus entirely on the Borova direction, which will significantly improve the logistics of the Russian forces operating in the area and the concentration of power in that direction. Further south, the Russians continue offensive operations along the Serebryansky river line here in the Serebryansky forest area. The Russians are slowly pushing to gain full control over the pocket created here along the river line, to gain control over the remaining parts of the Luhansk region within the Serebryansky forest area, and to clear the remaining parts of Ukrainian forces that have been cut off in this direction. Their only escape is through the Seversky river line in the southern direction towards Siversk, where the Russians are also pushing to cut off those positions as well. Following this, the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Yempil, where they have managed to secure the fortified positions along the Ostrich farm into the northeast of the settlement, giving a clear road to resupply the forces within Yempil. However, the positions within the town are still not clear, as the Russians and the Ukrainians are mixed within the settlement. Some basements have Russian soldiers, while others have Ukrainian soldiers. There's no clear split within who controls what within the eastern parts of the town, but a lot of artillery fire is taking place within it, as the Russians and the Ukrainians are striking each other whenever they spot each other. So we're seeing a lot of fighting taking place here in the Serebryansky forest area in the direction of Yempil and north of Serebryanka, as Russians continue offensive operations towards Siversk and Liman. To the northeast of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians continue their counter-offensive operations, regaining control over the fortified positions here north of Pankivka. This allows them to continue their offensive operations to cut off the supply lines of the Russian forces going towards Kozyrov Yar further north. The Russians are here combining their defensive positions from Nikonorivka to the west with the positions near Pankivka and Mag to the south and Novoshakhova to the north to prevent a Ukrainian breakthrough in the area. However, with the Ukrainian capture of the fortified positions, they're able to threaten the thin supply line that remains under Russian control. The Russians need to gain control over Nikonorivka and to regain control over Pankivka if they're looking to keep their supply lines in the direction of Kozyrov Yar stable. Otherwise, the Ukrainians can cut off the single supply line that leads further north, and the Russian forces will be forced to withdraw from Kozyrov Yar and Novoshakhova, significantly minimizing the size of the Russian presence northeast of Pokrovsk. The Russians are attempting to reverse the situation from the eastern flank, where they are developing their own offensive operations to regain control over the parts the Ukrainians recently captured, and flanking Volodymyrivka and Shakhova from the east. If the Russians are able to push to Shakhova from the eastern flank through the main road and enter into the town, they'll be able to cut off the supplies coming from the northern direction in the northeast towards Sofiivka, And if they're at the same time able to cut off the road to the northwest of Shahove, then the Ukrainian forces in Shahove, Volodymyrivka, and operating south of it will all be encircled. The Russians can look to gain physical fire control over these roads or physically cut them off. Either case will limit the offensive capabilities of the Ukrainians in the area. If the Russians are able to hold on to their positions and the supplies going into Kosherev Yar, they'll be able to outlast the Ukrainian forces. If in turn the Ukrainians are able to hold their positions on their flanks and continue their push through the Russian positions here in the direction of Nikhonorivka, then they'll be able to cut off the Russian positions north of Kosherev Yar. So we're seeing a reversal situation where the Russians and Ukrainian forces are launching simultaneous parallel offensive operations to achieve the same, which is cutting off the supplies and gaining control over the flanks of their positions, both of which depends on the outcome, can significantly improve the situation for either side. If the Russians are able to gain control over Volodymyrivka and Shahove to the northeast, it will significantly improve the logistics of their forces operating in the area, with additional supply lines going further north and in the southern direction towards Novoekonomishne. The Russians will be able to, in combination with their efforts to combine their forces from Fortifcations to Novoekonomishne, significantly improve the logistics of their forces in the north, which will then allow them to launch offensive operations to gain control over Rodinske, push in the direction of Dobropilya, and further north to cut off the road between Dobropilya and Kramatorsk along the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk to Konstantinivka line. In the southwestern outskirts, in the direction of the eastern flank of Zaporizhia, the Russians continue in the direction of the first line of defense to gain control over additional significant portions of the defensive line, as well as the southern parts of Novoivanivka. Russians are here looking to gain control over the town and the fortified positions. What really surprised me is the fact that the Russians are gaining control over a significant portion of these fortified positions day after day. Managed to gain control over a significant portion of the first and second lines of defense as soon as they managed to flank both of these lines. Now the Russians continue offensive operations to gain full control of them all the way down to Hulyaipole. At the current pace, the Russians would be able to gain control over Hulyaipole within a few months, which will allow them to gain control over the eastern flank of Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk and open up the road to gain control over logistical hubs in the northern and northeastern flanks of Zaporizhia and to the north of the current positions. This will allow the Russians to significantly improve the logistics of their forces in the area and also to threaten the Ukrainian logistics and the ability to resupply the forces operating here in the northern flank of Zaporizhia. So we're seeing a lot of fighting taking place, mainly for logistics, whether it is improving their own logistical situation or minimizing the enemy logistical positions and situation. The Russians are here looking to improve their positions for potential offensive, while the Ukrainians are looking to limit the offensive capabilities of the Russians. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.